What would you do if you knew you had just 24 hours left to live, knowing you'd been sentenced to death for a crime that shook the country? Teresa Lewis had an IQ of 72, never pulled the trigger, yet became the first woman executed in Virginia in almost 100 years. On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis, a 41-year-old mother from the quiet town of Danville, Virginia, found herself confined within the stark walls of Greensville Correctional Center, counting down the final hours of her life. She awaited the moment when the lethal injection would silence her forever, a fate sealed by a crime that left a lasting scar on her community. Teresa's journey began decades earlier, rooted in the hardships of a childhood marked by poverty. Born and raised in Danville, she grew up in a modest household where both parents toiled long hours at the local textile mill, a place that would later become a significant part of her story. Dropping out of school at just 16, she married young, hoping to build a better life. Still, her first marriage crumbled under the weight of her struggles with alcohol and painkillers, leaving her vulnerable and searching for stability. At that same textile mill, she met her second husband, Julian Lewis, a connection that seemed to promise a fresh start. Yet her life took an even darker turn when she crossed paths with two men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, at a Walmart in 2000, an encounter that would set the stage for a tragedy years later. In 2002, driven by desperation and the lure of a $250,000 insurance payout, Teresa orchestrated a chilling murder-for-hire plot, leading to the deaths of Julian and her stepson Charles at the hands of her accomplices. As her final day approached, the weight of her choices hung heavy, but so did a question that lingered in the air. With an IQ of 72, a mind deemed borderline intellectually disabled, and no direct act of violence, was Teresa truly the mastermind behind this crime? Or had she been manipulated by those who escaped with life sentences? This ethical debate, pitting her punishment against the fates of the triggerman, remains at the heart of her story, inviting us to consider the fine line between justice and mercy as we step into her last 24 hours. Teresa Lewis's story stretches back to 1969, when she was born into a world of struggle in Danville, Virginia. From the start, her life was shaped by hardship, growing up in a family where money was tight and opportunities were few. Her parents worked tirelessly at the Dan River Textile Mill, a sprawling factory that dominated the local economy, but their efforts couldn't lift the family out of poverty. Teresa's education ended abruptly at 16 when she dropped out of school, a decision that reflected the limited prospects around her. She married young, hoping to carve out a stable future, but that first marriage quickly unraveled, leaving her to face personal demons alone. Her battles with alcohol and painkillers became a constant companion, pulling her deeper into a cycle of despair as she tried to numb the pain of her broken life. It was during this time, working at the same Dan River textile mill that had defined her family, that she met Julian Clifton Lewis Jr., a man who seemed to offer a chance at redemption. Their marriage in the late 1990s brought her a stepson, Charles, and a semblance of normalcy, but beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. In 2000, a chance encounter at a Walmart parking lot changed everything when Teresa crossed paths with Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, two men who would later play a fateful role. For 2 years, this connection simmered until 2002, when Teresa's desperation took a deadly turn. Driven by the promise of a $250,000 insurance payout from policies on Julian and Charles, she hatched a cold-blooded plan. She offered Schallenberger and Fuller a mix of sex and money to carry out the killings, leaving the door unlocked at her home on October 30th, 2002. While she waited nervously elsewhere, the two men entered and shot Julian and Charles in their sleep, ending their lives with ruthless efficiency. The crime shook Danville to its core, a quiet town unaccustomed to such violence, and Teresa's role as the orchestrator soon came to light. But what seemed like a straightforward case took a controversial turn when Teresa's mental capacity came into question, raising doubts about who truly held the power in this tragic tale. The investigation into the murders of Julian and Charles Lewis began the moment authorities arrived at the family's home in Danville on that chilling October morning in 2002. The scene was heartbreaking. Julian, 51, and his son Charles, 25, lay dead, their lives stolen by shotgun blasts as they slept in their beds. Suspicion quickly turned to Teresa, who was found nearby, visibly shaken but ready to talk. Almost immediately, she confessed to the police, her voice trembling as she spun a story of a robbery gone wrong. She claimed that intruders had broken into the house, killed her husband and stepson, and left her helpless. But her story didn't hold up for long. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a web of evidence that pointed to something far more calculated. They discovered that Teresa had purchased the very shotguns used in the murders just days before, handing them over to Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller with a clear purpose. On the night of the killings, she had left the back door of the house unlocked, ensuring the two men could slip inside without resistance. Perhaps most chilling was a phone call she made to her daughter Kathy, hours before the murders, where she said, "I might not see you for a while," a cryptic message that hinted at her knowledge of what was to come. The evidence of premeditation was undeniable, painting a picture of a woman who had planned every detail of this tragedy for the promise of a $250,000 insurance payout. By 2003, Teresa, Schallenberger, and Fuller were all in custody, facing trial for their roles in the double homicide. The courtroom in Pittsylvania County became the stage for a case that would grip the community. Prosecutors presented Teresa as the mastermind, arguing that her actions, offering money and sex to her accomplices, buying the weapons and orchestrating the plan, made her the driving force behind the crime. But her defense team fought back, highlighting her low IQ of 72, which placed her on the borderline of intellectual disability. They argued that her limited mental capacity made her vulnerable to manipulation by Schallenberger, who they claimed was the true architect of the plot. Despite this, the court wasn't swayed. The judge labeled Teresa the head of this serpent, holding her more accountable than the men who had actually pulled the trigger. In a shocking outcome, Teresa was sentenced to death, while Schallenberger and Fuller received life in prison without parole, a disparity that would later fuel fierce debate. As her execution date loomed years later, a global debate erupted. Should someone with her mental capacity face the ultimate punishment, especially when the law itself was beginning to question such sentences for the intellectually disabled? As the sun rose on September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis woke up inside Greensville Correctional Center in Girard, Virginia, knowing it would be her last day alive. The 41-year-old mother had just 24 hours left before her execution, a moment that had been looming ever since her death sentence was handed down years earlier. Inside the cold gray walls of the prison, the weight of her reality was heavy, but Teresa tried to find some comfort in the little time she had left. She spent the morning with her family, including her daughter Kathy, who had stood by her despite the pain of the past. They shared quiet moments, likely filled with tears and whispered words of love, as Teresa tried to make peace with those she held dear. Around midday, she was offered her final meal, a simple yet meaningful choice of fried chicken, peas, and a slice of apple pie, foods that perhaps reminded her of better days in Danville, before her life had taken such a dark turn. After eating, Teresa met with the prison chaplain, a moment of spiritual reflection that offered her a chance to pray and seek forgiveness in her final hours. She clutched a Bible, her hands trembling as she spoke softly, asking for strength to face what was coming. As the clock ticked closer to 9 p.m., Teresa's mental state was a tangled mix of emotions. With an IQ of 72, her cognitive limitations likely made it harder for her to fully process the gravity of her situation, but she must have felt a deep sense of resignation, knowing there was no way out. At the same time, fear surely gripped her. Fear of the unknown, fear of the pain, fear of leaving her daughter behind. Her limited understanding might have amplified her anxiety, leaving her to grapple with a reality she couldn't entirely comprehend. Outside the prison walls, the world was watching. Protesters gathered in the fading light, holding signs that called for clemency, their voices echoing with demands for justice. Among them were advocates who argued that executing someone with Teresa's mental capacity was a violation of morality, especially after the 2002 Supreme Court ruling in Atkins versus Virginia, which banned the execution of the intellectually disabled, though the definition of intellectual disability remained murky. High-profile figures, including author John Grisham, had publicly pleaded for her life to be spared, pointing to the gender bias in her sentencing. Why was Teresa facing death while the men who actually pulled the trigger were serving life sentences? The debate raged on, but Virginia's governor denied her clemency, sealing her fate. At 9 p.m., prison officials escorted Teresa to the execution chamber, a sterile room where a gurney awaited. She was strapped down, her arms extended as IV lines were inserted. Witnesses, including media representatives and state officials, sat in silence behind a glass window, watching as the clock struck 9:13 p.m. Before the lethal drugs began to flow, Teresa spoke her final words, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just want Kathy to know I love her, and I'm very sorry." Moments later, the injection started, a combination of chemicals that would stop her heart within minutes. By 9:13 p.m., Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead, her life extinguished as the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century. Her death left behind a grieving daughter, a divided public, and a lingering question about whether justice had truly been served. Teresa Lewis's execution may have marked the end of her life, but it was only the beginning of a firestorm of controversy that would echo far beyond the walls of Greensville Correctional Center. At the heart of the debate was her mental capacity, a documented IQ of 72, which placed her on the borderline of intellectual disability. This number wasn't just a statistic, it raised profound questions about her culpability in the murders of her husband and stepson. Critics of her sentence pointed to this, arguing that Teresa's limited cognitive abilities made her an unlikely mastermind. They believed she was far more vulnerable than the court had acknowledged, potentially manipulated by Matthew Schallenberger, one of the triggermen who carried out the killings. Schallenberger himself later confirmed these suspicions in a chilling revelation before his death by suicide in 2006 while in prison. He admitted that he had used Teresa, exploiting her for the promise of money, knowing her desperation for the insurance payout made her an easy target. He claimed he was the true planner of the murders, a confession that cast a shadow of doubt over Teresa's role as the so-called head of the serpent. Yet despite this admission, Teresa had already been sentenced to death, while Schallenberger and his accomplice, Rodney Fuller, were serving life sentences, a disparity that fueled outrage among those following the case. Why was Teresa, who never pulled the trigger, facing the ultimate punishment, while the men who committed the act were spared? Some argued that this reflected a deep-seated societal bias against women, particularly those who defied traditional roles. Teresa wasn't the grieving widow or the nurturing mother society expected. She was a woman who had orchestrated a crime, offered sex and money to her accomplices, and stood to gain financially from her family's deaths. To some, her sentence seemed to carry the weight of judgment, not just for her actions, but for her failure to fit the mold of what a woman should be, a bias that may have tipped the scales toward a harsher punishment. Beyond the courtroom, Teresa's case sparked a broader conversation about the death penalty itself, especially for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Just 8 years earlier, in 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Atkins versus Virginia that executing people with intellectual disabilities violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But the ruling came with a catch. It left the definition of intellectual disability up to the states, creating a gray area that Teresa's case fell into. Her IQ of 72 was just above Virginia's legal threshold at the time, but many experts argued that such a narrow margin failed to account for the nuances of her mental capacity, her susceptibility to manipulation, and her inability to fully grasp the consequences of her actions. Advocates for Teresa believed her execution exposed the flaws in a system that struggled to balance justice with fairness, especially for those whose minds work differently. Her death became a rallying cry for those pushing to abolish the death penalty altogether, with protests and vigils held in her name, and her story featured in news headlines around the world. The question of whether she was a cold-blooded killer or a pawn in a larger scheme lingered, dividing opinions and igniting debates that continue to this day. So I want to hear from you. What do you think? Did Teresa deserve the death penalty, or was she a victim of a flawed system that failed to protect the vulnerable? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. As we reach the end of this journey, let's reflect on the final chapter of Teresa Lewis's life. On September 23, 2010, inside Greensville Correctional Center, she faced her last 24 hours with a mixture of quiet moments with her family, a final meal of fried chicken, peas, and apple pie, and prayers with a chaplain before the lethal injection took her life at 9:13 p.m. Her story began decades earlier in Danville, Virginia, where poverty and addiction led her to orchestrate the 2002 murders of her husband, Julian Lewis, and her stepson, Charles, in a plot driven by a $250,000 insurance payout. She confessed to the crime, but her low IQ of 72 and the revelation that triggerman Matthew Schallenberger may have manipulated her sparked a fierce controversy. Sentenced to death while her accomplices received life, her execution as the first woman put to death in Virginia in nearly a century ignited debates about mental capacity, gender bias, and the fairness of the death penalty itself, questions that remain unanswered to this day. At the heart of this story are the victims, Julian and Charles Lewis, whose lives were stolen in their own home. Their families suffered an unimaginable loss, a tragedy that cannot be overlooked amidst the legal arguments and public outcry. Their deaths remind us of the human cost behind every headline, a pain that lingers for those left behind. Teresa Lewis's story leaves us with a haunting question. Where do we draw the line between justice and mercy, especially when the mind behind the crime struggles to understand its full weight? It's a question that challenges us to think deeply about the systems we trust to deliver fairness. If you found this story gripping, hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime deep dives that uncover the stories behind the headlines. And if you're curious for more, check out our next video on another controversial case. Find the link in the description and keep exploring with us.